Tutaj selivar tavisha sambo Anunis tam snogi dołem sitwa sandos Tu kusta migdevka helvalem pardon Sheni etgilika kuidra unda shabab kadros Tutaj selivar men Imashi karşı ve itriyarem telika me Kavet sale vitsali koçeme vidamo Vitsile dato veditsa çamo samtole Tutaj seli biçe tutaj suri teme Vitay ho heri bavşuba tavisha takeme Kapiris bireme bitta tota silvarulit Tuksa zog çerzali yancaklar tuli Ham drostu jivatriale bumbebs Kucami farsta tadvam se putzlebs Şibeşi vikeke bivkika bolo hurtebs Mutleb şimşil zarf gavar susteb Tum kreski thariro suli borgav Çatvaleka gandeki yarbic hebramis vodkmas Tum terselo debi kutai shimon khavs Çormitsit remoxtedam gidi ara moshchas Bostan Tris magive benzini asches Pati vissema çakles Da prioritetia puli Kamdeni tema ertvanechi gadakhlaftes Le kutai selivar kuchis lepit vodzam luli Sara Brinegar, welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. Thank you for joining us today. Why don't you introduce yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me. My name is Sara Brinegar. I'm trained as a historian of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. I got my PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I am actually not in academia, and I have a full-time non-academic job in an unrelated field, but I'm excited to talk to you today about my book.
Awesome. I got a chance to read your book. It was great. So I'm also really excited to talk to you about it. For our audience, your book that is just come out this year is called Power and the Politics of Oil in the Soviet South Caucasus, Periphery Unbound, 1920 to 1929. So if you could just give an outline, what is your book about? And also maybe after you describe your book, tell us like how you got interested in this topic and why are you, why did you decide to kind of research the South Caucasus, the Soviet South Caucasus?
I'll give you a high-level overview and then I can answer more specific questions as they come up. So the book is about basically how the Soviet Union leveraged Baku's oil to consolidate power in the South Caucasus in that really early pivotal period, primarily in the first half of the 1920s, but I do kind of allude to the rest of the 1920s. It follows broadly three threads. So looking at the political and economic effort to rebuild the oil industry after the Civil War, the conflict within the Bolshevik Party over local autonomy and oil politics in the Soviet effort to establish themselves on the international stage. I'm really looking at the interplay between the Baku Party and the Moscow Party. I have a specific focus on a couple of individuals. We can talk about them as we go along, including Alexander Serebrovsky, who was the head of the Azerbaijan Oil Trust, Nariman Narimanov, who was an Azerbaijani statesman, Sergei Orjonikidze, more familiar Georgian Bolshevik, and Leonid Krasin, who was the Commissar of Foreign Trade. And very basically, the argument is that a functioning economy depended on reestablishing trade, access to railways, and the pathway to the international market, and the oil in Baku was a really big part of that. There's 5 chapters that very broadly the book looks at the Soviet invasion of Baku, the reestablishment of the industry, the Gilan Soviet Socialist Republic in northern Iran and how that played out in Soviet foreign policy, Soviet concessions policy, which was the effort to try to sell Soviet concessions, so lease Soviet industry to foreigners in the early 1920s, and then the creation of a Soviet oil company in Iran, and finally a Bolshevik Control Commission investigation into Nariman Narimanov. So that's kind of the big overview. How I got into the topic is interesting. It goes quite far back. Actually, it was during my master's degree, which is the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. And I had just read Jeff Sahadev's first book on Tashkent. And I loved it. And I thought it was really interesting. And I loved this idea of focusing on a specific place and really kind of diving into that place and understanding what was happening. And I wasn't really sure where to look. It depended on what sources were available. It was an MA, it was shorter. I kind of needed to find something that was in Russian, that was a primary source. The library holdings at U of I are pretty fantastic. And they had some really great material on Baku, and they had some Kaspi, the newspaper that was directed toward the Muslim population, but was written in Russian. So I started reading that, and I thought it was super interesting. Read about the Baku commune, and I was in. So that was really how I started. The project evolved quite a bit once I entered my PhD program, and when I finally went to Azerbaijan. I didn't really start with the idea of looking at oil. That came later. And that really came after I went to Azerbaijan on the critical language scholarship many years ago, and just saw oil everywhere. BP was everywhere, Halliburton, the whole, it was pretty constant. And I thought, well, what's going on? Wanted to learn more, started trying to read some of the literature, wasn't really finding answers to the questions I was looking for. Everything was about the imperial period, pretty national focused lens from the literature coming out of Azerbaijan, and just sort of disappeared until World War II. So I thought that was a good place for me to look and see what was going on.
I was excited to have you on too, because this is actually one of the first episodes that we've been able to talk a little bit more about Azerbaijan and Baku. And it is only right that, the main topic is oil, which is so important to the history of Baku. So could you just give a little bit of outline about the importance of Baku and Baku oil in the Russian Empire prior to Sovietization? So let's start there. Like, why was Baku an important city, and what role did oil play in imperial Baku?
Baku produced over 90% of the empire's oil and oil products, and the main market was domestic. Really, it was a very local production. It was not a big industry until after the 1870s with the land reforms. But once it opened up, it grew very, very rapidly. There was a lot of foreign investment. The vast majority was backed by British capital, by the Nobel family as well. And really, it produced kerosene, I mean, oil product at the time, and that changed a little bit with time. It increasingly became more about fuel oil. But initially, its importance was related to the fact that it was producing kerosene, but also that it was developing infrastructure in the South Caucasus. So the railway, for example, between Baku and Batumi, these railroads are constructed specifically to transport oil and to make sure that the kerosene gets to the international market. I do want to say that the oil industry at that time was nothing like the oil industry that we know today, or the one in the second half of the 20th century. And even at its peak, it really didn't carry the kind of political capital that oil carries right now. But nonetheless, it was an important commodity. And it went through a lot of changes. We'll talk about this, but the international market for Baku's oil basically disappeared after 1905 with the Russian Revolution of 1905 and all of the changes that happened in the local conflict. But by World War I, again, it was more important strategically and also for industry and for the war. So there are a lot of shifts in the industry in a fairly short period of time.
Baku in the Russian Empire is one of the global leaders of oil production, right? This is a city that is famously associated with the production of oil. But also, I think, importantly, for the purposes of the story of Sovietization of the South Caucasus, Baku is also a city that is multinational. It is a city that becomes a hotbed, if not the hotbed of Bolshevism in the South Caucasus. And it also becomes a place where a multinational Bolshevism emerges. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how industrialization of the oil in Baku produced not only a large constituency of Bolsheviks and kind of a breeding ground of Bolshevism, but also how this class and national dynamics kind of played out in Baku, because this is very important. And then on top of that, if you could just go over what was the Baku Commune of 1918, because I think that this is also very important.
Yeah, you're right, Ryan. So the oil industry was really a catalyst for growth. Massive changes in the city, massive changes in the fields outside of the city in Absheron Peninsula, where the oil fields are located. And what happened was you just have this very big influx of people attracted to the oil industry, and all the things blossomed around the oil industry. So you have labor migrants coming in from across the Russian Empire to work in the fields. You have in-migration from Iran to work in the oil fields. You also have Muslim peasants, Azerbaijanis, as we would call them today, moving into Baku from the surrounding countryside. But what you end up having, obviously, there's a large Armenian population in the city. So you have three large populations. You have a large Russian population, Armenian population, and Muslim population, primarily Azerbaijanis, but not only Azeri speakers. You also have the Iranian migrants. You have a lot of Tatars from Kazan come into the city. You have Talish, other groups. So very, very mixed population, but the city is divided. It's divided along ethno-religious lines, reflection of the estate system that existed at the time. You also have this reflected in social class and in occupation. So what you really end up having is sort of a Russian higher class that's very white collar, not really connected as much to the Muslim population of the city. Armenians population, also very white collar, worked in refining industry and then in the oil fields. And this is a very rough characterization, but in the oil fields, then you have more Muslim workers, local workers. There are some big Muslim magnates, a couple of them, but primarily this is something that is Russian and Armenian who are producing the oil and owning the oil. Obviously the British interests as well. And then you have the dirtiest jobs, the hardest jobs are filled by Iranian-speaking, well, Azeri-speaking Iranian citizens, Iranian migrants. And their role is important because it changes as between 1905 and the revolution particularly. But it led to a lot of resentment and a lot of mistrust. People were being displaced. There was a lot of inequality. The estate system gave a lot of rights to Christians that it didn't give to Muslims. So you had a lot of tension. And when you had a very small space that grew very, very rapidly, it led to a lot of conflict, particularly between the Armenian and the Muslim population. I can talk about 1905, happy to do that as well. But I think the real point is just that this was a period of massive change, massive growth. The empire as a whole was really being strained, and this was reflected very clearly in Baku. And I think that it's also really important to note that Baku was very different from the surrounding countryside. This is a very rural population, especially between, you have the Elizabethpol gubernia, and this is much more rural. You have Tbilisi, you have Baku, and really in between you have a lot of villages, farms. This is a peasant community. So I think that's important to point out. How it became a hotbed of Bolshevism for all of those reasons. I think that there's a combination. It's a borderland. So right, and this is a permeable border. This is a border with shared populations. You have Azeri-speaking Muslims both in Iran and in the Russian Empire. You have Turkic-speaking peoples, obviously, in Turkey. You have Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, Armenians in Iran. You have Russians going back and forth. Georgians were very involved in particularly in the constitutional revolution and the other revolutions happening in Iran. So this is really just a population that's moving back and forth between different states. It's very porous. It's a port city. It's really easy to smuggle things at ports. This is pretty well established. Big industry, active population. Obviously, a lot of the people that we associate with the Stalin period came from the Caucasus, and sort of the height of the Bolshevik party. Basically, they could hide there. It was far away from St. Petersburg. It was far away from power, the rules were very different. You didn't have, even after 1905, you never had local zemstvas, so local governing bodies in the Muslim community. They were not allowed. The oil industry actually had purview over a lot of the city and all of the oil fields. They made the rules, which was more about extracting oil and not about setting up a ton of schools and resources and things like that. So you really had a pretty unruly environment that was also very harsh. The climate is really quite harsh as well. So a lot of factors that led to why Bolshevism thrived there. To turn to the commune, which is fast forwarding a little bit, but the commune existed from, it was also called the Baku Council of Commissars, the Baku Soviet Commissars, April 1918 to September 1918. Very short period of time, but really resonated and became part of Soviet lore. It was a coalition of revolutionary groups that was led by the Bolsheviks. As you said, Brian, this was, not just Russians, not just Armenians. This was all sorts of different groups, including local Azerbaijanis, local Azeris. They all were in the Baku commune together. They tried to set up a bastion of Bolshevik policies in Baku. They took over the city. They started nationalizing different industries, introduced all sorts of policies that would have been familiar to people in Russia proper. But it also was something that, and for the purposes of my book, it really led to deep, deep fissures within the coalition of Muslim, Armenian, and Russian Bolsheviks that lasted throughout the 1920s. And I think one thing that can't be overemphasized is that it really was bookended by violence. The commune was established after a massacre of the local Muslim population by a coalition of Bolshevik Red Guards and Dashnak Armenian soldiers. And this, or I guess they're not technically soldiers, activists, party members. And then this, the commune collapsed when the Ottoman army combined with the local Azeri army, and they also then massacred the Armenian population. So we have this bookend of violence that really changed the way the commune was viewed locally. So in Moscow, this is something that's turned into lore, but locally, this is really associated with these massacres and really changed the way that the Bolsheviks were perceived in Baku as well. And it really meant that when the Bolsheviks decide that they're going to come back into Azerbaijan in 1920, they needed to come back differently, and they needed to come back and take into account the population that was actually there. And that's something that we can get into more.
Kind of interesting that a Georgian was the governor of Baku, not Ashidze. And like this Bolshevik revolutionary discusses, like she's sent to Baku to do revolutionary work, and like all of a sudden these like pogroms against Armenians like begin, and she's like shocked. Well, she's also Russian, so she like doesn't understand all the Caucasian nationalities and what's happening. It's like very interesting to see it from her perspective of like, she's like, I couldn't even do political work because I was so confused about like, all the different like groupings and ethnic parties. And so I could like imagine what a hotbed it was, like just complete like, plus everybody's incredibly radicalized. Like everyone's radicalized. She talks about even the janitors, the housemates, everyone is radicalized. And so like having all that energy, besides the Russians, because actually they were apparently spies often for the Tsar, like having all that energy becoming such a like interesting but also very dangerous place.
I think that's really important, because it's not just, my focus obviously is on the Bolsheviks because I'm looking at the creation of the Soviet Union. But the reality is there are far more groups active than that. Right? There are so many different groups of people. There are religious groups, there are right-wing groups, there are nationalist groups. So this really is, as Sopo said, it's a hotbed. There's a lot going on. I'm definitely simplifying. It's a confusing situation.
One thing I really like in your book throughout, and you definitely mention this multiple times, is like this is not an Azeri story or a Russian story, but this is a Soviet story. And when you talk about the Bolsheviks of Baku, you go to great lengths to say the Baku Bolsheviks, led by a multinational grouping of people, of Orjonikidze, of Mikoyan, of Narimanov, of Midivani, that there is like this kind of Transcaucasus Bolshevik milieu that comes into being because of the particular conditions of Baku that transcend the sort of nationalisms of the South Caucasus. And I think that that's like a really important framework that's sometimes very difficult to translate into the modern post-Soviet hyper-nationalistic frameworks of history and of politics that are dominant in the South Caucasus. So like I really appreciated that point of your book. And that kind of leads into my next question, which was when we're talking about these old Bolsheviks of the South Caucasus and in particular of Azerbaijan, I want one of the main characters of your book is Narimanov. And Narimanov is, of course, somebody who is not very well known today, especially outside of the South Caucasus, but in this period was incredibly important. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about who was Narimanov and, why was he such an important figure in the Sovietization of the South Caucasus, and in particular, the trajectory of the Soviet Union's politics in the East, because it seems as though it's like he's a figurehead as well of these, of how Soviet policy outside of Europe into the Middle East and into the so-called Orient will go.
Narimanov, very interesting. He's someone who, if you go to Baku, he was rehabilitated at the, home that I was staying in Baku had, sort of all of these memorial like plates with Narimanov's face and little tchotchkes and busts and things like that. So he definitely is a figure that came back after the fall of the Soviet Union, I think, and he's much more contested today. But he was born in Tbilisi in the late 19th century. He was many, many things. He was a teacher. He was a playwright. He was a medical doctor. He was a political organizer and an activist. He also wrote a very famous novel that was turned into a play. It was called Bahadar and Sona. It was a love story between a young Muslim student and Armenian woman. It is something that was talked about quite frequently. He always pointed it to it as his progressive view on national relations and nationalities. But it was also strongly about Muslim identity and things like this. But basically, he was a socialist and he wanted to end Tsarism. How he wanted to do that, he became more radical over time, but he was very resentful of the system that he was in, felt like it held back the Muslim population in particular, that it was intentionally keeping them out of schools and out of education and out of politics, and he wanted to change that. So Narimanov was a founder and participant in many different socialist and national-minded groups. He was with the Himmat Party, which was founded around 1905, aligned itself with the Bolsheviks, associated on and off with the Bolsheviks throughout the period leading up to the Civil War. By the revolution, as early as 1905, he is aligned with the Bolsheviks, and Lenin in particular. And his relationship with Lenin becomes really important with the establishment of Soviet Azerbaijan. He was also a commissar in the Baku commune. He escaped the fate of the other Baku commissars, all of whom were shot except for Mikoyan, because he was sent to Astrakhan before the collapse because he was ill. So because he was sick and he was not there, he is one of the other surviving members, one of the other surviving commissars, although I don't think he's often talked about that way. He becomes the head of Soviet Azerbaijan. I have a whole argument about this. I published an article about this years ago in Slavic Review, which is this oil deal between Narimanov and Lenin, which basically is Narimanov agrees to help establish Soviet power, ensure that Russia gets access to Azerbaijan's oil, Baku's oil, and agrees to follow Soviet policy.
One thing about your book that I thought was very refreshing was that you talk about the Sovietization of the South Caucasus and the trajectory of early establishment of nationality policies through a commodity, through a natural resource, and you make it a material question, right? So, for example, when you talk about the Sovietization of Georgia, you don't talk about it in terms of even ideology, national tension, or imperialism or something. You talk about it through the political imagination of the Bolsheviks in the Caucasus and their understandings of oil, and the way that the oil is sort of shifting and shaping the political strategy of establishing Soviet power and ensuring that the revolution exists. And so I'm just wondering if we could use this opportunity to talk a little bit about that. Like, how did oil kind of ensure that Sovietization of the entire South Caucasus would happen, and how did that play into the political imagination and strategy of the Bolsheviks in the South Caucasus, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and in Georgia? People like Orджonikidze, Narimanov, Mikoyan, and others.
This is something that surprised me a little bit. So I think that I was familiar with the historiography, right? So I knew that when the Red Army came into Azerbaijan, that Stalin and Orджonikidze and others immediately wanted to go into Georgia and immediately wanted to go into Armenia and establish Soviet power everywhere. But they, were told, absolutely not, you're not allowed to do that. And then sort of this process, I knew this process happened slowly, that there was this, slowly relatively, that there's a proposal to unify the railroads and there's a proposal to unify the economy, and that sort of slowly seeps and becomes this bigger project to establish Soviet power throughout the South Caucasus. But what I was wondering, well, what are they talking about? Sort of what is the actual conversation that's happening at the time, looking at the correspondence, looking at the archives, and they were talking about the oil industry. They were talking about the fact that they needed to get Baku's oil to the ports. And the ports were on the Black Sea, and they were in Georgia at the beginning, occupied by the Ottoman army. But this was how the industry was originally set up. As we talked about at the beginning, you set up these railroads specifically to transport oil. It is the access to the foreign market. So for the Soviets, there was no way that they were going to live with either an independent Azerbaijan or an independent Georgia. In terms of what that meant for Georgia, the Bolsheviks, they viewed Georgia as, and this is something Sopo mentioned, as a staging ground for foreign intervention in Soviet Russia and the Caucasus more broadly. They thought that they were harboring enemies of Bolshevism. They were harboring English spies and German spies, and that they were trying to destabilize Azerbaijan, and that if they destabilized Azerbaijan, it would have very deep consequences for the Soviet economy in Russia and the Russian war effort, which was not finished. It just started the war again with Poland. So there are multiple fronts that are still happening. They needed to stabilize the Caucasus. There's also famine, right? They needed to get food back and forth. So this is really a strategic situation that they're looking at. They didn't want to lose the fields. They didn't think that there was any way that they were ever going to get access to the railroads and the ports without controlling Georgia. And they wanted to reestablish trade. So it was also a way to amass troops and then to plan for those invasions and wait for the right time to do it. And then once they actually did go in and militarily take over Armenia and Georgia, that sort of binding together, as I call it, of these different aspects, the argument to control the railroads and to control the trade is directly related to them wanting to, as I've said, get the oil to market, because oil at this time is the only source of hard currency, and the economy has basically collapsed. War communism just destroyed the Russian economy, and they need any kind of hard currency, gold, anything that they can get, and this is one of the only ways to do it. So this was one of the impetuses behind this unification is this infrastructure and reestablishing those trade networks. This isn't to say that there's no nationality politics happening. They're certainly also using them. They use them as an excuse as well for the Orджonikidze in particular keeps saying, they're just going to keep fighting with each other. So if we don't go in there and stop them, these Armenians and Muslims, they're just going to keep fighting and they're going to keep everything unstable. And the Georgians are trying to take all this territory too. And we can't be having that. So we have to go in and stop them all. So there is an element in there of, we're going to promote peace and stability. And I think that they did enforced a certain kind of peace and stability that would allow for these networks to start again.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting explanation that I've heard, like one of the better ones out there of what was happening. I have like a theory. I think what you're saying is much more factually based. Mine's more like theoretical. That it was also just really about the divergence of the Menshevik politics versus the Bolshevik. I'm talking about Georgian Bolshevik politics versus Georgian Menshevik politics, which at the end of the day, like the Bolshevik politics are much larger scale than the Menshevik ones. Much more about state, the nation state of Georgia versus the Georgian Bolsheviks, which have like a much more transnational viewpoint and sort of more of the workers of the world unite versus like, the nation state that will have social democracy, alongside with like economic needs, like and famines and so on, which honestly, it's the most unenviable position I could ever think of, was like Bolsheviks coming into power. It's like complete crisis. Georgian socialists used to interfere in the Middle East for positive, more like secular, progressive kind of reasons, and then speed up to 2000s, and Georgians are aligning themselves with NATO to go into Iraq and Afghanistan. So I always find this like almost 100-year difference, and it's like complete different approaches to the Middle East.
I had the same reaction, honestly. So from Azerbaijan perspective, where it was like, you go back and you read these documents from the 1920s in this time period, and they're absolutely afraid of the British, and they're afraid of, what is now BP, Anglo-Persian. But then you go to Baku now, and it's just BP everywhere. And I was like, this is such a reversal. It's such a 180. How did we get here? And so I agree that the Bolsheviks did have they had a grand sort of world scale project, and it did make their agenda very different. And there was also a very specific local context in the Caucasus about the relationship with Iran. It was part of the local imagination of what the socialist revolution would include. It would include Iran, particularly northern Iran. And this was something that, there was this, especially this Georgian connection, in addition to the Armenian-Azerbaijan connection. Orджonikidze fled to Georgia, or fled from the Russian Empire to Iran, and he stayed in Iran for years, became part of that group associated with the Bolsheviks there, and also other revolutionary groups. They saw it as a joint fight against imperialism, a joint fight against Shah and against the Tsar. And these are again, lots of back and forth. They're trading weapons, they're trading ideas. The Georgians are, there's Narimanov is also part of this. He is organizing among the on the Iranian side of the border as well as on the Russian side of the border. They are all they're just part of this big revolutionary group. They go back and forth. When there is the amnesty later, Orджonikidze comes back. So they're also they're fermenting revolution there as well. They're bringing guns, they're bombing things. It's very, I'm waiting for the book on that. I would love somebody to write just this book that looks at them in this time period and all of these different connections of who is where and how they're related to these different political parties.
This part of your book that's about the Bolsheviks from the Caucasus, especially Ordzhonikidze, and their engagement in this establishment of the Northern Iranian Gilan Socialist Soviet Republic that fails. I think in your book, you use this as an example to show how, and this is something, of course, Sopo was just referring to as well. You use this as like an example to show that there was this local political context that did not always align with what, say, Lenin or others in Moscow necessarily strategically thought was important at a given time. And that, but the interesting thing is that sometimes discussing this history is very difficult in the contemporary discussions about the Soviet past in the South Caucasus, because people like Ordzhonikidze were very much were not only in favor of the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution, but wanted to take it further than people in Moscow were willing to condone, And so it's interesting to say that it was like the Caucasus Bolsheviks who were pushing for revolutionary intervention into Iran. Ordzhonikidze is arguing that the Red Army should join the Caucasus Bolsheviks and go to Tehran and overthrow the Shah. And of course the Soviet leadership are very nervous about this because of certain geopolitical considerations and resources. And so what your book kind of shows is that not only that there was this regionally specific and autonomous political imagination of Bolshevism in the South Caucasus that needed the revolution in Russia, but was also something completely separate from it. So how did this, I guess, both intervention into Iran was one of the questions and that Sopo was referencing, but then also kind of going further from that, how does this regionally specific or kind of independent Caucasus Bolshevism politically factor into, I guess, the establishment of Soviet power in the South Caucasus and its trajectory?
Yeah, you're right, Brian. I use this as an example to show how the Bolshevik Party, which I call them the Baku Bolsheviks because they all went through Baku or were tied to Baku in some way, kind of went a little bit rogue in this Soviet Socialist Republic in Iran, the Gilan Soviet Socialist Republic. Not to say that they didn't have permission of sorts to go in and establish these links and try to set up a party and see what would happen, but this is really something that crosses what we would now look at right as national lines and at the time as well. So this is Ordzhonikidze, it's also Mikoyan, it's also Medveni, it's also Narimanov. The problem there is that each one of them has their own agenda and they're all backing their own factions within this Soviet Socialist Republic. And those factions are not always the ones that Moscow want them to be backing. And they also, and then of course there are the Iranians themselves who have their own agenda, which is not the same one that the people from the Russian Empire want. And it's also, there's also the politics that are happening in Iran at the time with Reza Khan establishing power and re-centralizing power there. So there's a lot of different overlapping conflicts, which I think is a theme for all of this. But this was they were given a certain amount of leeway, these Baku Bolsheviks, to go in and set up a party and try to establish Soviet policies. There's a lot of, I think that it was, from Moscow's point of view, it was basically opportunistic. I don't think that they, from an ideological point of view, thought that it was going to be particularly successful in establishing a communist power base, but they thought that it would potentially create friendly government on the border that would have been important and would have just allowed the Soviets to be able to project a little bit beyond its borders. They wanted to say in what was happening, but it was a fiasco. They didn't have control over the groups. As you said, Ordzhonikidze wanted to kidnap the Shah. It really turns into a bit of a mess. They don't have the resources to do it. Nobody wants to follow the Bolsheviks. They do what they did in Azerbaijan and in Russia, which is, instead of getting the population to agree with them, they confiscated all of the goods and beat everybody up, which didn't really make people very sympathetic to them. It alienated the local population, and they very quickly split with Mirza Kuchik Khan, who was the head of it's called the Jangali independence movement that was allying with the Bolsheviks to set up this republic to begin with. And they ended up having, so they're actually, this is something that I think is important. The invasion never officially was a Soviet invasion, right? A Soviet Red Army invasion. It was a invasion that took place under the flag of Soviet Azerbaijan. And that was to preserve the illusion of independence, even though everybody knew it was happening. Everybody knew that these were Red Army troops and the Red Navy. But it just allowed for a little bit more political leeway for people not to get involved. I think we know about that with Little Green Men. This is a strategy that is employed pretty frequently when you want to send in armed troops and you don't want to admit that they're there. So this was part of what they were doing. But then you ended up having a lot of armed, angry people who were hungry and not getting paid. So it quickly spiraled out of control. And actually Reza Khan, soon to be Reza Shah, had to intervene and ended up paying Soviet Azerbaijani salaries and then sending them back to Baku. So the whole thing kind of implodes. But the point was that they were told to back off. So these Baku Bolsheviks were told to back off by Moscow multiple times, and they did not. And the repercussions of that is sort of what led to these big splits in the party later. So I think that there's a couple of flashpoints. There's a flashpoint of the Baku Commune, which highlighted specifically to the Muslim population that the Bolsheviks didn't care about them. And then you have this split with Iran, where Moscow, Lenin specifically has a conversation, multiple conversations with Ordzhonikidze and Narimanov. Mikoyan kind of tells them, no, like, these are the new rules. We're not intervening in Iran. We have a new foreign policy. This foreign policy is going to work with these these national governments. We're not exporting revolution. We have to secure the revolution at home. And this is something that Mikoyan and Ordzhonikidze largely fall in line and say, okay, this is the new policy. We're going to do this after they get home, not while they're there. And Narimanov doesn't. Narimanov believes that this is basically sacrificing the Muslim East, as he calls it, for a European orientation in Soviet foreign policy. And he does not give up his agitation in Iran. And this leads to later problems as they start to question what his role is and should be in the Soviet project.
After Sovietization is more or less complete by 1922, you start to have Soviet-British negotiations, as well as this Genoa conference, and I think it's called the Rafalo Conference, where Soviet concessions And you, of course, outline how concessions are defined a little bit differently in the Soviet context. But concessions are being discussed because it seems like the Bolshevik leadership, so the now Soviet leadership, understand or at least believe that they have to concede some oil concessions, make some oil concessions to Western capitalists, and start these Soviet capitalist joint projects in order to basically get oil production up to a standard where the Soviet project can benefit from the oil that it has. Because as far as I understand at this point, it's like they have the oil, right? They can get it, most of it from out of the ground, but they have a very difficult time, ensuring that the product is making it to the international markets. And one big reason for that is, of course, because of the Bolshevik Revolution, all the infrastructure and capital is nationalized, and there are roadblocks that are being set up by some of the Western powers, at least formally. But you argue in your book that there's these informal discussions that are happening between Western capitalists and the Soviet government over the potential room to work together, and that if I remember correctly, Narimanov is the one who's more intransigent and opposed to some of these Soviet Western joint projects, and that there's some other Bolsheviks who also argue that the Soviet project, that this new Soviet state should not be making these concessions. So, like, could you just maybe go into some of this dynamic at this time after 1922 and after of Soviet concessions to Western powers, how those in Western capitalists, how that looks, and some of the debates that are playing out inside of Soviet society at the time?
This comes primarily from Lenin and also Krasin. They basically believe that there is no way that the Soviet oil industry can rebuild on its own. The industry was destroyed. The wells were flooded. The infrastructure was, although the railroads were still there, a lot of them needed to be repaired. The wells needed to be repaired. The technology had changed because the fields had not really been updated in any kind of substantial way since the ruin both of 1905 and then later with the Civil War. And when they initially take over the fields, when the Bolsheviks initially take over the fields in 1920, all of the oil reserves all of the cisterns were full. They had been filled to capacity when the British were there. As the British occupied Baku, we didn't really talk about that, but they took over the oil fields for a while, and the oil production had restarted, and all these reserves were just sitting there waiting to be used and to be traded. But production was not happening. So these are kind of two separate issues. One is that they were able to use the oil that had already been extracted to get resources, but that dries up. And once that dried up, and the Bolsheviks initially did a terrible job running the fields. They made the problems much worse. The wells became even further into disrepair. They didn't know how to fix they didn't have the resources to fix a lot of the machinery and get things restarted. So Lenin's plan was, and also Krasin, was to introduce, and not just in the oil industry, but across Soviet industry, concessions that would allow foreign companies to come in and basically restart oil production for a certain amount of time, and they would get a certain amount of money from the proceeds, and with that, they would be able to rebuild. This didn't happen for various reasons, but for the purposes of this discussion, there was the oil. Oil was kind of the big fish. That was what people were interested in. That was what they wanted to talk about. Both in Grozny and in Baku, they proposed these big concessions. On the ground, nobody liked this. They did not want this. Narimana, and this is a coalition at a time when there's already all of this friction between Ordzhonikidze and Narimanov about the Gilan Republic and Bolshevik policy more generally in the Caucasus. But they agree very strongly on this, and also Alexander Serebrovsky, that bringing in foreign capital and foreign businesses to rebuild the industry would be a huge mistake, that they can do it on their own. So they basically go about trying to prove London wrong, and to come up with their own ways to start rebuilding the industry, sometimes with permission and sometimes without permission. One of the ways they do this, and I think partly because there are, I guess, background context for this, is that the oil majors at the time, the British and French and American oil companies, so Standard Oil and Anglo-Persian, and also some of the French companies, are boycotting Soviet Union, so Soviet Russia and the other Soviet republics. So they're not trading with them officially. Behind the scenes is a different story. Deals that will come into effect about marketing Russian oil, market Baku oil, about contracts for heavy machinery, bringing things over. So they basically decide to try to make much more limited deals, this is kind of convoluted, but they end up getting permission to make direct deals. Serebrovsky does, the head of the oil trust, with foreign companies, and bring in supplies directly. So they start bringing in these supplies, and bringing in foreign expertise without kind of these big concessions, just in these small technical contracts. And they end up, after Genoa collapses and the Rapallo, there's a Treaty of Rapallo with Germany that sort of explodes the conference. They come away with no deal, but they do come away with all of these sort of bilateral arrangements, and are able to rebuild the oil industry without these big concessions. And this is really something that is defined by this local push against Moscow's concessions policies. They sort of resist this at every move, and say very clearly that they have the local expertise to do this. They have they also have the capacity to learn how to use all of this new equipment, and they end up turning the industry around, and they do end up being able to basically make these types of big political concessions unnecessary, at least in the way that they are envisioned at the time in 1922.
I kind of want to follow up with the kind of last part you just said, which is that there was these, especially local in the South Caucasus, opposition to Moscow's desire to make concessions. And you said at the end there that there was ultimately, they made the need to make political concessions unnecessary. They made political concessions essentially unnecessary, and then they turned the oil industry around. And so by 1928, if I remember correctly, you have the Soviet oil production at like pre-World War I levels. So like they basically turned the oil production into something very impressive, that it hadn't been for, at that point, I guess almost a decade or longer. And I'm curious, how were they able to do that? Just for our listeners, if you could explain, like, how were they able to basically avoid succumbing to concessions and still make oil production in the Soviet Union so effective?
This is interesting because this is one of those areas where the Russian language literature and the English language literature are completely different. And kind of figuring out what actually happened there is challenging. I think what I would say is the English language literature says, okay, they didn't have these big concessions where you literally lease out land, right, and say you have complete control over this territory and the land for 50 years or whatever it is. They didn't do those kinds of concessions, but they do make all of these like smaller scale concessions where you bring over foreign technology, foreign experts, and they rebuild it, right? So this one of these that I talk about is the bar install concession. So you bring over American engineers and you bring over all of this new drilling technology, and then the English language literature says, so, Western capital rebuilt it anyway. And then they're all kicked out, as everybody gets kicked out in the 30s, but that they reestablished it. The Russian language literature talks more about the local capacity and the ability to rebuild this. I don't think there's no doubt that they did bring in all of this new technology because drilling had changed, right? So there's like all these new types of deep drilling equipment that they needed to bring in to actually access the oil, which you couldn't do this kind of surface level drilling that they were doing before. So yes, they do. They bring them in, and the other part of this is that the Soviet engineers are traveling abroad at this time, especially Sara Brinegar. Right? He goes to Alaska and he comes to the US and he has all these meetings with Rockefeller. And so as much as the Soviets are pariahs, they are also very actively involved in the technological and business aspects of how to rebuild the industry. So I think that it's, as usual, somewhere in between. Yes, you had Western, certainly they need the Western equipment to rebuild, but you also had people who had worked in the fields for decades. I mean, even Leonid Krasin, who was the Commissar of Foreign Trade and then the ambassador to France, he worked in the oil fields. He helped electrify the oil fields in Baku. Sara Brinegar had worked in the Baku oil fields in the pre-revolutionary period before he was reassigned as the head of Osneft, which was the largest trust in the Soviet Union. So I think it's a combination of local expertise and the new methods that they brought in, and also the predictions were more dire than the reality. It looked really bad, and I think the other issue was because these were privately owned before the revolution. You had this little tiny subdivided patchworks that doesn't reflect like where the wells are, where the actual oil deposits are. They're all just kind of clumped on top of each other, and they're draining the wells and they're competing and they're trying to extract as much oil as possible. And so when the Soviets took over, they really had no idea what they had. So part of it too is just figuring out what's there. Like at the beginning in 1920, and I'd say through 22, they literally have to just go out into the fields and ask the people who are working in there, like, what's happening here? What do we have? How much are we producing? So, and they did that work of going out and like having these constant meetings, touring the fields, figuring out what's even there. When the Bolsheviks nationalized this industry, they destroyed the people who left, right? The private owners, they destroyed the records, right? You destroy the records of the oil production that had been there before. You destroy where the fields are. You destroyed what's productive, what's not productive. You're really kind of starting from scratch. So they really had to do a lot of on the ground work and also just bringing in resources. So this other thing, the Soviet government, and this is part of this like propaganda effort that they have to try to bring resources into the industry, is successful. They are able to get resources from Moscow. They're able to get permission to trade, to bring in products. They're able to conscript the Red Army to make them work in the fields and restart production. So really they have a large mandate that redirects resources toward the reconstruction of the industry. So I think it's this combination of all of these things that led to this successful pushback. And also the international situation changes pretty dramatically. So at some point, the sort of desperate Soviet position of being on the verge of collapse isn't relevant anymore because it doesn't look like they're going to collapse. So even if they're not entirely functioning, they're not on the verge of collapse anymore by the time you get to 1924, which is when this is all really. So I think the purpose shifts. These were concessions that were initially very economically driven, and they become much more political after the collapse of the Genoa Conference.
So, Sarah, your book is basically an intervention into the historiography and has implications, I think, for a lot of memory politics that happen in the South Caucasus. And in particular, there's oftentimes this very, especially in Georgia, this view of um, the Soviet Union as Russia. And very often what it does is it sometimes erases the local context of the Bolsheviks who were operating in the imperial periphery and had their own political imagination, their own political visions, strategies, and political interventions that actually did not always align with the interests of Bolsheviks in Moscow, but also kind of transcended these national boundaries of the pre-Soviet and the post-Soviet, and really were a Soviet, Bolshevik, and then Soviet political project. And so, what do you think your book and historical project offer for our understanding of Bolshevism and the Soviet history in the South Caucasus? What is the implication of your historical approach and book in a bigger picture?
I am making an argument that we need to have these more national and nationality focused arguments and conversation with some of the more material aspects of what's happening. So I'm not saying that they are more relevant or more important. I'm saying that they are inescapable. As you have to have both. You have to have both to understand what's happening. And I think for me, one of the other things that really came across in this time period in particular is what we come to call and associate specifically with Stalin and with his group of people, what Sheila Fitzpatrick's called his team, right? That wasn't really, it didn't start that way. These are people who had local concerns. Ordzhonikidze, even though he was the head of the Caucasus, the COF Bureau that ran the Caucasus, it's a central Russian body. He viewed himself as a local politician, a regional politician, like a person who was concerned about the South Caucasus and was concerned about its role and its future. And only later has he sort of become this much more associated with Moscow's man. I think the same thing with Narimanov. Very ironically, he is viewed locally as Moscow's man, but in Moscow, he's absolutely not, right? So he's viewed as somebody who only has these narrow national interests of the Muslim population in mind. So I think that it's just important to see that this is not, and this is why I call it a Soviet story, right? Like I know that is an uncomfortable time period. It's something that's often just sort of skipped because it's hard to integrate into national narratives right now. But it was important. It was important for establishing independent states. So as much as we turn to 1918 and 1920 and these periods of independence, I don't think there's any question that the Soviet Union is also a nation-building empire, which I think can confuse people. How can something be an empire and be nation building? But the Soviets did it. And I think that I think one way to think about it is to look at these things much less as mutually exclusive. They're overlapping, and there's a constant interplay between the material and the economic and the national and the sort of the way that these different ideas intersect obviously changes over time, not too surprising. But I think one of the things in the Caucasus in particular, and Transcaucasia in particular, is that it was originally set up, there were these big arguments, right, about that this should be an economic unit. And there was, we know this from Fran Hirsch's work, that we had these different paradigms about how to set up the Soviet Union. Is it going to be economic? Is it going to be national? How are we going to do this? We know that the national sort of paradigm won out. And for that reason, I think it's inescapable to talk about nationality policy and how it shaped the Soviet Union, because it's how the state was structured and it's how resources were allocated. But we need to talk about those resources, and we need to talk about who was in charge of them and how they were being produced. And I think that, as I said in the Caucasus, this was the economic paradigm didn't cease to exist. It was still operating. It's just operating underneath it, right? So they are kind of stacked on top of each other. And I think that there is literature that is more explicitly looking at the nation part of this. It gets to this Christogoff's work, Claire Kaiser's work, right? They're looking at the way that these sort of interplay. And I think this is true outside of nationalities policy. I think that this is true in more of the economic policy in the material realm. And you can't really understand how things are playing out on the ground if we don't understand the material reality that they're operating in and the constraints that they have based on some of those constraints, or based on the resources that are available.
We're always trying to connect the history that we hear on this podcast to make sense of today. And also the continuing importance of, Baku oil, especially with even right now through the sanctioning of Russian oil, how Baku plays an important part for, say, EU, right? And seeing the Aliyev, very much considered sort of dictator, but gets like a warm greeting from the EU than Putin, who's also a dictator. So I find all this very fascinating, and how this very small place actually, 'cause you always, like, I always have this thing like, how important can this oil really be? But incredibly important, as we see historically and currently. So maybe we can end on, how do you connect your research, your book, to current events?
That's a great question. I had the same question. It is small in terms of like actual, output now and percentage of production, and it's not that significant globally. I think so. It has to be something else, right? And that's what it came back to, and that's what it came back to. Looking in the 1920s, that it's geopolitical. It's about being strategically located. I know that there is certainly a push, which I understand completely, to not only look at the Caucasus, and specifically not to just look at Azerbaijan as its relationship to other states, right? What is its relationship to Russia? What's its relationship to Iran, the EU? But to look at it in its own terms and what it's doing. And I understand that pushback, and I think it's a valid pushback. But I also think it's inescapable that it is strategically located, and that has shaped its future, and its past, for better and for worse. And I think that keeping in mind that there's always that we need more context, right? You can't just go to Baku for a weekend and say, oh, look, Baku looks nice, things here are fine. And I think that happens a lot. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I think that I would agree with you, Sopo, that it is I think that it is challenging, and we should be asking questions about, what types of relationship we want with a government like the Aliyev government. But is it a wholesome government? Certainly not. Is it without its problems? Not for the Azerbaijani public. I would say that it's very complicated for them. But there's also no question that Azerbaijan is a very different place than it was during the Soviet period. And I think that is something to keep in mind for all of the South Caucasus. What it looked like in 1980 is absolutely not what it looked like today. These countries are all much more homogenous than they were. Massive population transfers between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the course of the 90s. They have really, really changed the way that they look, and who lives there and who doesn't live there. And we obviously see that major consequences to that. So I think it can be hard to recapture some of this history. And for me, what is important about this is, one, to see that things always change, and that this is an area that was much more intermingled in ways that someone like me would hope they can be again in the future. I think it's important to see that these are like this stark division is relatively new, and wasn't the way that things worked before, and doesn't have to be like this forever, and is related to the current governments that are in place across the region. And I think that, it's just important to keep in mind that sometimes the questions that we ask about the Soviet period need to go beyond whether it was good or bad, but how people experienced it and what they were doing and what was driving decisions. And oil is certainly strategically important, but it is also a way to look at other questions that people were concerned with. And I think that that's true today. What are these oil deals that are being made, and who are they serving, and what's it for, and how they fit into wider politics is a question that also affects people locally, and something that we should be looking at.
לא צוחדה או בזארי לו אני טוב וואלה כמו דירקטה פוקידה דיטו דיטו לא רחודת ונצטרו בסלבריטו מגזור מתעדה סוור ממקיטו מבדיטו קוטאי סליוואר דענק שני מבוסורס ובידה ביטו בזאר סרבוב כביוואר צואלי דאר מרה פוליטה אלכוהולי אזרביטן ורצ'י דחס תלי צ'ואלי קוטאיס איפי הגאנה בפרטס אב ותודאיץ תומוגי קיתחן מרב אסוכי הגאיץ סעזו אריקן לצידת רוזי הדרגאיץ ביטו שני קייפ במרדו פוליטה פייפ בולו בולו צחתי אנוש שסרשית הבית Kutai skuče mi hami arari lajti Neko edu svija ma mečevic vam iskaj Kutai si kalaki arari, kutai si kultura Che ikari da game kanet kultura Tăzda soșki, kutai si abbaza Gai khierelo de bamski kabaza Da khalik khalsu pali twalsu galim gals Mudam de bamsa soos man kutai sals Harvisi swaka lakshiro kurda krishia Wara abkani asiya kutai sali barsima Suda sharib sitib tara ghatta gasenit Trin kutai slepi wad kuta khiyan gaselit Suda sharib sitib tara ghatta gasenit Trin kutai slepi wad kuta khiyan gaselit